Welcome to your third assignment, which is creating a policy and procedure that will be used by a volunteer program. We have designed the video to help you walk through all of the assignment steps. So as you'll note, this is the actual assignment details that are found on your assignment tab. There are two parts to this assignment. Part one is creating a policy and procedure for a volunteer program. The other part is answering in short form some questions about the policy and procedure that you have created. The goal of this assignment is for you to create a comprehensive policy and procedure that will be used by a volunteer program. The first thing to do is think about who the audience is for this volunteer policy and procedure. Is it going to be for the volunteer manager? So in other words, are you providing a policy and procedure and instructions for a volunteer manager on how to carry out a particular policy that you're writing, for example, training or screening or recruitment? Is it for a volunteer? Is the volunteer going to be carrying out this policy and procedure? It could be, for example, reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses or dress code, something that a volunteer might need to do, sign in and sign out, or the recording of their hours. Is it for a staff member? Is it describing what the expectations are for a staff member to provide support and supervision for a volunteer? Or is it for a board member? Because quite often boards are volunteers and they have specific processes that they need to carry out. The thing that is interesting about policies and procedures is that you can adapt them for your organization. So you may actually create a policy and procedure that can be used not only by the volunteer manager, but at the same time a volunteer. And we'll show you a couple of examples that incorporate this. So stop, think about where you need your policy and procedure, who is going to be using it, and another thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about your policy and procedure is your organization's culture. Back in the one module, we talked about the importance of being aware of your organization's culture and the language that they use in communication. So as you're writing your policy and procedure, make sure that you're incorporating or using a language and a tone that is appropriate for your organization. In a unionized environment, it might be very black and white and direct. In an organization that is perhaps a hospice, the tone might be slightly softer. Regardless of the language that you use and the tone, you must use plain language techniques when you are writing your assignment. And in fact, this applies to all of your assignments. And the last thing to keep in mind is please don't submit an existing policy and procedure that you are using in your program or organization. We teach a very specific technique and it will not use for this assignment. So looking at your actual assignment details, you are going to be creating two separate files. It's probably easier for you to create two separate documents and upload into the Dropbox. The first part is please identify the title of the policy and procedure. That should be followed by one or two brief paragraphs that describe your organization. This goes back to we are looking for the type of organization, what your programs and services are, how the volunteers and staff kind of work together, and we're looking particularly for the tone and the language used in that organization. We just mentioned that briefly earlier. So that when you're describing your organization, when we go to evaluate your policy and procedure, we're looking for a match in the tone and the language used by your organization and how you've created your policy and procedure. Again, this is where you're going to identify who the audience is for your policy and procedure. So in other words, who is going to be using this policy and procedure. The next thing we ask you to do is describe briefly, again, another one or two paragraphs at the very most, why you need this policy and procedure. In the module, we have very specifically explained there are 4 functions for policies and procedures. So think about that as you're writing your answer. Why do you need this policy and procedure? And just explain what its use is, why you need to have it in place, where you found a hole or a gap, or if you might want to be proactive. The next step then is to make the direct connection between why you've explained you need this policy and procedure and the policy's function. And this is actually in your module. There are 4 functions of a policy and procedure. It can be for risk management, a rule. It can be values and beliefs, or it can be for performance management. Please be aware your policy and procedure may incorporate 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those functions. And we'd like you to explain the connection between the function and your need for the volunteer policy and procedure. And the final step in the short answer is to, again, briefly explain how you will roll out this policy and procedure. In other words, how are you going to introduce this policy and procedure to the individuals using it? Are you going to be sending it to the board for approval and then rolling it out in perhaps a monthly meeting? Are you going to print hard copies, circulate them, put them in a volunteer handbook, send it out in a newsletter or an electronic update? Is it going to be introduced during orientation and training? So in other words, if you are creating a policy and procedure, it is important that individuals are aware of the policy and procedure. Now, moving on to part 2 of the assignment. This is where you're actually creating the policy and procedure. You may use the template that we've provided, or you may use your own organizational template. Totally up to you. What we're looking for are key sections in the headers. Make sure that those heading sections or labeling sections are included in your policy and procedure, and it's also helpful if you can or is to include a logo. The next section you'll be doing is writing a procedure, and we again are using a very specific technique for carrying out the procedure. This is all detailed and examples are provided in the module. What we are looking for in your assignment is specifically who will be carrying out the policy and procedure. You've already identified this in the first part of your assignment, so you're going to be indicating this in your procedure. Then it's going to be followed by the directive. Shall, must, or should. Shall is a legal requirement. Must is there could be legal consequences for not following the policy and procedure. Should is best practices. This is all explained in the actual module. The reason we teach this technique is to make sure that the person that is the audience for the policy and procedure knows it is for their directive and for their carrying out of the policy and procedure and why they need to carry it out. Quite often people say, well, why do we need this policy or procedure? Who said this? The directive shall, must, or should gives you a simple explanation of why they need to carry out this policy and procedure. Then you're going to use the techniques taught and list in logical, ordered, numbered, sequential steps how to carry out the procedure. They are all simple one-sentence action statements. If you have information or you find you want to keep adding information to the procedure, that means you don't have enough information in your policy. If you need to explain something, that should be up in the policy section that explains what it is the person needs to know and why they need to know it. So let's take a quick look through a couple of samples. They are going to be spread out over a series of slides. This is an example of a part A, or the first part of your assignment, where the individual has very briefly explained and described what their organization is. So quickly I can see this is a small hospice with 24-hour care. that it is for families diagnosed with life-limiting diseases. They talk about the connection between the staff and the volunteers and the holistic support and approach they use to the quality of life and quality of service. There is no cost involved, and also they mention that it is funded by the government and how important volunteer participation is crucial in their successful daily operations. The next question to answer was, why do you need this policy and procedure? As you can see, there's a couple of very key points. One, they're looking at the relationship between the volunteers, the residents, and their family members. So there is a very clear relationship that is usually formed in this type of environment. The other thing that they are concerned about is gifts. Quite often in a hospice situation, or even when you're dealing with other vulnerable clients or seniors, family members or clients want to offer a gift just as a way of saying thank you for the help and the support and the care that they have received. However, it is also a violation of that relationship between the volunteer and the client and their family members. So they have made it very clear that this is a rule that no volunteer can accept any form of gift because it could be seen as favoritism or prioritizing the care of one resident over another. There's also implications from Revenue Canada and tax credit implications. They also have a conflict of, they're worried about conflict of interest. So they are very concerned that there is a boundary in place, that volunteers cannot cross this boundary and accept any form of gift or money in exchange for care. Here is how the connection is made between the policy for functions and the explanation. This is quite detailed. You may not need to go into this much detail, but you can see they have made the connection between the risk management function, and that speaks to setting boundaries and maintaining those clear lines of relationships, and risk management as far as equal care and attention at all times. They've also made the connection between values and beliefs. They believe everyone should be welcome regardless of their background, culture, religion, financial situation, and that should not have any impact on the care. They also want to make sure that they do not cross any personal beliefs or biases. That, again, you want to offer care without judgment or preference. And this policy, by clearly stating no gifts or can be accepted, keeps that bias out of the relationship. It's a rule. As mentioned in risk management, this is a legal requirement. They've provided some information about how they can carry this out, and it's a boundary, and if that boundary is crossed, there could be consequences. And it's also meant to support and enhance their programming so that volunteers are never put in an uncomfortable position of having to make a decision about what to do if a family member or a client offers them a gift. The final part of Part A is explaining how the policy and procedure will be rolled out. You can see this policy and procedure is going to be sent to the Board of Directors for review. Then it is going to be edited and the final draft will be sent out. The policy is going to be introduced to the volunteers during their monthly email communications, during bi-monthly meetings, and there's also a way that they can connect with the volunteer manager to have any of their questions or concerns addressed. Let's take a quick look at Part B of the assignment. This is the actual policy and procedure. Here is a very simple, clean template with the title of the policy and procedure. The policy and procedure title should be very clear, simple, and concise so that as soon as you look at the title, you know exactly what the policy is about. They have indicated who it applies to. So the volunteers, managers, coordinators, so this is both volunteers and staff. Their policy explains what it is the volunteer needs to know, why they need to know it, what information they need for in case they're put in that particular situation that someone has asked to provide a financial gift, and the consequences. It's always handy to indicate what the consequences are for not following out the policy and procedure. It's broken down to the procedure. All volunteers must, so audience and directive. 4 simple steps, all started by action verbs, all single sentences, all direct action statements, along with a contact information. Now we're going to take a quick look at another sample. This is over 2 slides. Very simple template, simple title so that we know exactly what it's about. In this example, they've actually given some background information about the policy because it is directly related to a government requirement and it speaks to accessibility. They have included a policy statement directly referencing the Ontario's with Disabilities Act and why this certificate is required, what it is they need to know about this particular training, and also the consequences. So you can see the consequences are down here, that a volunteer cannot begin their position unless they have a current certificate. They've also indicated that the organization will cover any potential costs related to this training. When we look at the procedure, this is an example of where they've indicated 2 audiences. So here, this is the volunteer manager is the audience and what they must do because there are legal consequences for not following it. 5 quick sentences, all starting with an action verb and their action steps. They've also got the combined it with the volunteer's expectations. So again, prior to volunteering, the volunteer must. And here they have got 8 steps, all single sentences explaining how to carry out the policy and procedure. The next example is very different. This has a very simple template, quick title and heading. It explains what the individual needs to know. In this case, it is for the volunteer coordinator, staff, and even for volunteers. It explains what they need to know, why they need to know about this particular policy, or how to register a short-term or indirect service volunteers. In other words, this is a one-day episodic position. The reason they use this term indirect service is directly related to the terms and classifications they use in this organization. What is different about this policy and procedure is you can see it is linking to all other policies and procedures that support this policy and procedure. And there is a link to an appendix. So to carry out this policy and procedure, they can go to the appendix and actually pull the forms that need to be completed with this particular policy and procedure. So the group roster and the liability waiver. This policy and procedure uses a chart format. And if we scroll to the top here, we can see the volunteer administrator must follow the following registration process. And it's broken down into a chart. And because it's a one-day volunteer position, they have a very simple process for registering the volunteers, and they have actually captured everything from step 1, the documentation, 3 quick action steps about what the volunteer manager or the volunteer administrator must do in the registration process. Step 2 has information about screening, orientation, supervision, and then records management. So they have captured most of the volunteer management processes in one simple step. Hopefully this has given you some ideas of different ways that you can approach your policy and procedure assignment. Please make sure you reach out to your instructors if you need any more direction, information, or you would like us to take a look at your assignment before you submit it.